He didn't explain much. Just one sentence. Check 2 p.m. every Tuesday. Then he hung up. I stood there holding the phone long after the call ended, staring at the wall like it might answer the question he refused to. My neighbor, Mr. Darnell, wasn't the paranoid type. Retired engineer. Quiet. Predictable. The kind of man who trimmed his hedges with a ruler and waved exactly once when you passed. He didn't call people with warnings. Especially not me. We weren't close. Friendly, yes, but not close enough for coded messages. I looked at the time. Monday. For 17 p.m., tomorrow would be Tuesday. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a glitch. Maybe he thought someone was stealing packages. But something in his voice had been wrong. Tight. Measured. Like someone choosing words carefully because they might be overheard. That part stuck with me. I walked into my home office and opened security system dashboard. I installed it myself 3 years ago after a break-in 2 blocks away. 8 cameras. Full perimeter. Cloud backup. Motion alerts. I rarely check recordings unless a notification popped up. My life wasn't dramatic enough to require surveillance. Until now, I scroll back through archive footage. Tuesdays. 2 p.m. The previous week loaded. The driveway was empty. Mail truck at 1:52. Nothing unusual. Then at exactly 2:03 p.m., a white van entered the frame. No logo. No plates visible from that angle. It parked directly across the street. Engine idling. I leaned closer to the screen. The van stayed there for 9 minutes. No one exited. No one approached my house. Then it drove away. I felt a small chill, but told myself it could be coincidence. Delivery vehicle. Contractor. Wrong address. I clicked back another week. Same time. Same van. Same parking spot. Same 9-minute window. My stomach tightened. 3rd week. Identical. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. Always Tuesday. Always 2 p.m. Always 9 minutes. I rewound the footage frame by frame. The windshield reflected too much light to see inside. Windows tinted dark. The van never moved closer. Never attempted entry. It just watched. Or waited. I switched to my side camera that covered the backyard fence line. Nothing. Then the garage camera. Empty. Front porch. Still. But when I zoomed into the street camera at 2:07 p.m. on the 2nd week, I noticed something that made my pulse jump. A faint flicker in my living room window. A reflection that shouldn't be there. I cross-checked with the interior camera I kept disabled for privacy. It was off. Always off. I physically unplugged that 1 month ago. I stood up and walked into the living room slowly, staring at the exact window angle captured in the footage. The reflection could only have come from inside the house, not from the street. My mouth went dry. I hurried back to the office and pulled up the system diagnostics log. Tuesday, 1:58 p.m. Camera 5 temporarily activated. My heart slammed against my ribs. Camera 5 was the interior unit, the one unplugged. It showed a 2-minute live session at 2:01 p.m. Remote access, external IP address, then deactivated every Tuesday for 6 weeks. Someone was turning on a camera inside my house and watching. The van wasn't random. It was a signal, a confirmation. Someone nearby verifying something in real time. I checked user access. Only one account had administrator privileges. Mine. No secondary users. No shared passwords. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. This wasn't random theft. This wasn't porch pirates. This was coordinated. System-level access. Intentional. Quiet. And it had been happening under my roof for over a month. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I didn't answer. It stopped after one ring. A minute later, a text arrived. Did you check? No name. No punctuation. Just that. My hand shook slightly as I typed back one word. Yes. 3 dots appeared instantly. Then disappeared. Then one final message came through. Then you understand why I can't say more. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't paranoia. This was surveillance. And if someone had access to my cameras, they might have access to more. I looked around my quiet house, suddenly unsure what was private anymore. Tomorrow was Tuesday, and 2 p.m. was less than 20 hours away. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt closer. Every shadow looked wrong. Tuesday was coming. By morning, my house no longer felt like mine. It felt staged, like a set someone else could watch at any time. I disconnected the entire security system from Wi-Fi at 9 a.m., then checked the router logs manually. There was again a remote login attempt scheduled for 1:59 p.m. every Tuesday, originating from an encrypted IP that masked its location through rotating servers. Not amateur, not random. Whoever had access knew how to cover their trail. I called my service provider pretending to troubleshoot lag issues. They confirmed something that made my chest tighten. The remote session had bypassed normal authentication through a back-end maintenance override. That meant either the manufacturer had a vulnerability or someone with internal access was exploiting it. I hung up slowly. Mr. Darnell had said, check 2 p.m., not be home, not hide, just check. That meant he knew it was happening in real time, which meant he could see it too. I glanced at the clock. 1:32 p.m. I had less than 30 minutes. I reconnected the system, but mirrored the feed to a secondary offline laptop through a local capture program I installed years ago during a consulting job. If someone accessed my cameras again, I wanted a local recording that couldn't be erased remotely. At 1:58 p.m. exactly, the system log refreshed. My pulse spiked. 1:59 p.m. Camera 5 initializing. The unplugged interior camera flickered alive on the dashboard. I hadn't physically reconnected it. Yet there it was. Live feed, my own living room, from inside the ceiling corner. The angle was slightly adjusted this time. It zoomed in, not toward the couch, not toward the door, but toward my desk across the room. My desk drawer, the top right one. My breath went shallow. That drawer contained nothing valuable, just old documents, warranty papers, a backup USB drive. Then it hit me. The USB drive. I'd forgotten about it. It contained archived financial records from a consulting project 5 years ago. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but proprietary infrastructure designs. High-level access mapping for regional networks. Sensitive enough to matter. The camera zoomed tighter. The feed froze for half a second, then stabilized. Someone was adjusting it remotely. At 2:03 p.m. exactly, the street camera showed the white van pulling up again. Same spot, engine idling. My hands trembled as I split-screened both feeds. Interior camera, van outside. This wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. The van wasn't spying. It was receiving or transmitting. At 2:04 p.m., my router log showed a data spike. Large outbound packet transfer. Encrypted. My stomach dropped. They weren't just watching. They were copying something. I moved quickly. I yanked the Ethernet cable from the router entirely. The interior camera feed cut instantly. The log froze. Silence returned to the house like a held breath finally released. Outside, the van idled for another 30 seconds, then drove away. I replayed the captured footage on the offline laptop. Clear as day, the camera had activated, zoomed, and held focus on my desk drawer. That wasn't random movement. That was targeting. I opened the drawer carefully. The USB drive sat exactly where it always had, untouched physically. But if they had accessed my local network, they could have reached the desktop backup synced years ago. I rushed to my office computer and checked recent access logs. At 2:02 p.m., a remote command attempted to query local storage directories. Blocked because the machine wasn't connected to the network at that moment. I hadn't realized my paranoia about keeping work devices offline would matter this much. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This time I answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a distorted voice said quietly, "Reconnected next week." The line went dead. My blood ran cold. They expected compliance. Like this was routine. Like I was part of it. I stared at the silent house around me. Every wall suddenly feeling thinner. Mr. Darnell hadn't warned me about theft. He'd warned me about infiltration. And whoever was inside my system wasn't just watching for curiosity. They were searching for something specific. something they thought I had. I looked at the USB drive in my hand and realized something worse than being watched. I wasn't the target. The data was. And someone believed it was worth risking exposure for. I didn't call the police. Not yet. This was bigger and too precise. The van hadn't returned, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than noise. I locked every door, shut every blind, and sat at my desk staring at the USB drive like it might explain itself. 5 years ago, I'd worked as a consultant on a regional infrastructure redesign. Energy grids, data routing, emergency failover mapping, high-level systems. Nothing classified, but detailed enough to matter in the wrong hands. When the project ended, I archived everything offline and wiped my connected drives. Or at least, I thought I had. If someone believed that drive still held something valuable, they weren't guessing. They knew. That meant either the original project had resurfaced, or someone inside that system had leaked my name. I powered on an old air-gapped laptop I kept for exactly this reason. No Wi-Fi card, no Bluetooth, clean operating system. I inserted the USB drive and waited as it mounted. The directory structure looked untouched. Spreadsheets, mapping files, network diagrams, encryption keys? No, those had been transferred years ago. But then I saw something I didn't recognize. A hidden file, timestamped 3 weeks ago. My pulse spiked. I hadn't plugged this drive into anything in months. That meant the file hadn't come from me. I opened it carefully. It wasn't malware. It was a compressed folder labeled Tuesday. Inside were screenshots, grainy, time-stamped images taken from my own interior camera feed. My living room, my desk, my hands. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m. And beneath the screenshots, a single text document. We know what you kept. That was it. My chest tightened. They weren't copying data. They were searching for confirmation. They believed I still possessed something from that infrastructure project. Something critical. I thought back to the final weeks of that contract. There had been tension, budget overruns, a disagreement about a vulnerability we discovered in a backup routing protocol. I'd recommended patching it immediately. The client had postponed. 2 months later, a small outage occurred, nothing public, but enough to cause internal panic. I'd signed an NDA and moved on, unless someone hadn't. I replayed the captured footage from the offline laptop again, frame by frame. At 2:04 p.m., just before I pulled the Ethernet cable, the interior camera zoomed further than before, tight enough to capture the label on my filing cabinet. They were mapping my room, learning my patterns. That wasn't smash and grab behavior. That was intelligence gathering. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mr. Darnell. I answered immediately. "You saw it," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," I replied. A pause. Then, "They've been parked outside my place too. Same time, different weeks." My stomach turned. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked. "Because I didn't know if you were involved," he said flatly. That stung, but it made sense. From the outside, maybe it looked like I was coordinating. "I'm not," I said firmly. Silence. Then he added, "They're not thieves. They're testing response." That word echoed. Testing. If they were testing how quickly I'd notice, how I'd react, whether I call authorities, then pulling the Ethernet cable had changed the script. They'd lost visibility mid-session, which meant they now knew I was aware. I checked my router again. The encrypted IP hadn't returned, but there was something new. A small outbound ping attempt at 2:11 p.m. From my smart thermostat. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't just the cameras. It was a network. Everything connected was a doorway. "They're inside more than you think," Mr. Darnell said quietly, as if reading my mind. I leaned back, heart pounding steadily now instead of racing. Fear was shifting into focus. Whoever was probing my home believed I had something critical. They were patient, coordinated, technically capable, and bold enough to park in plain sight every week. I looked at the screenshots again, then at the text file. "We know what you kept." They were wrong about one thing. I didn't know what I kept either, and that meant I was about to dig deeper than they expected. I stopped reacting. I started digging, because panic feeds predators, and clarity traps them. The screenshots weren't random intimidation. They were reconnaissance, which meant someone believed I had retained something far more valuable than a few outdated diagrams. I reopened the infrastructure archive carefully and searched metadata, not file names, hidden attributes, embedded comments, system tags. That's when I saw it. One configuration file labeled temp_patch_route 17. I remembered that argument vividly now. Route 17 had been a vulnerable failover line, an emergency reroute path connecting 3 regional substations. During testing, we discovered that under a specific load condition, the backup authentication key defaulted to a static string for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of open access. It was supposed to be fixed immediately. Instead, it was postponed to Phase 2. Phase 2 never came. I opened a file and read through it slowly. The patch script was incomplete. A comment in my own handwriting read, "Client refused deployment. Risk unacceptable." I had kept the unfinished patch locally in case the client reconsidered. I never deleted it, because engineers don't delete warnings. We archive them. If someone still had access to that vulnerable infrastructure, and if it had never been corrected, this file wasn't just a patch. It was leverage, or worse, a blueprint for exploitation. My pulse slowed into something colder. This wasn't about corporate espionage. It was about infrastructure control, power grids, hospitals, emergency systems. If Route 17 was still live and still flawed, someone could force controlled outage, trigger cascading failures, or test penetration points without immediate detection. And if they believed I kept the final override key, they might be trying to confirm whether I had the only safe fix. I cross-referenced the client's name with recent public records. 2 months ago, they had been acquired by a larger holding company with ties to international energy distribution. Ownership had changed. Oversight had shifted. If vulnerabilities existed, they might not even know. Or worse, someone inside might. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't unknown. It was a block number routed through an internal exchange prefix I recognized from my consulting days. I answered without speaking. The distorted voice returned. "You disconnected early," it said calmly. No anger, just observation. "You were copying files." I replied evenly. A pause. Then, "We're verifying integrity." I felt a tightness in my jaw. By breaking into private networks? Silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then, "Reconnect next Tuesday. We'll confirm the patch." The line clicked dead. Confirm the patch. They weren't asking if I had it. They were assuming I did. I walked into my garage and checked something I hadn't thought about in years. A locked metal case stored behind old toolboxes. Inside were paper printouts from the final days of that project. Handwritten notes. Hash strings. A master authentication override generated during testing and never deployed. I stared at the sequence printed on faded paper. If this key still matched the live infrastructure, it could close a vulnerability instantly. But in the wrong hands, it could also grant temporary administrative control during that 8-second window. The van wasn't just surveillance. It was proximity verification. A field team confirming network response while someone remote attempted entry. They weren't criminals in hoodies. They were coordinated operators. And they believed I still held the final missing piece. I returned inside and powered down every smart device completely. Then I called Mr. Darnell. "It's not about my house," I said quietly. "It's about the grid." Silence. Then he exhaled slowly. I was afraid of that. There was only one move left that wouldn't escalate this privately into something dangerous. Because if I tried to confront them alone, I'd become a liability. I looked at the printed override key in my hand, then at the archive patch file on the offline laptop. They thought they were testing me. They didn't realize I was about to bring this into a room they couldn't control. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the company. I called the one agency that handles quiet threats. The FBI field office wasn't dramatic. No flashing lights. No long waits. Just a secure desk and a man who listened without interrupting. I didn't start with theories. I started with proof. Router logs. captured footage, the van timestamps, the remote access attempts. Then I placed the printed override key and the archive patch file on the table. If Route 17 is still active, I said evenly, this vulnerability exists right now. The agent didn't blink. He asked 3 precise questions. Was the infrastructure still operational? Yes. Was the key valid at last test? Yes. Did anyone else know I retained it? No. He nodded once and stepped out of the room. When he returned, there were 2 more people with him, Cyber Division. They took my offline laptop, mirrored the drive, verified timestamps. The screenshots from my own camera were the moment the room shifted. They're conducting signal verification. One of them muttered, field presence, remote access handshake. That was the same conclusion I'd reached. The agent looked at me carefully. Why didn't you delete this years ago? He asked. I didn't hesitate, because I knew someone would ignore it. He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. By the time I returned home, an unmarked vehicle was already parked down the street, not watching me, but watching the pattern. Tuesday was 2 days away. They asked me to reconnect the system as requested, to let it play out, controlled observation. I agreed under one condition, no silent escalation inside my house without my knowledge. They agreed. Tuesday arrived heavier than the last. At 1:57 p.m., the agents were staged discreetly, 2 houses down, one monitoring a mobile command unit further out. My system was reconnected exactly as it had been before. At 1:59 p.m., the interior camera activated again. Same zoom, same angle toward my desk. But this time, the FBI mirrored the live feed in real time. At 2:02 p.m., the van rolled into position. Same white exterior, same 9-minute window. But this time, they didn't just idle. A signal analyzer in the mobile unit lit up. Short-range relay, one agent whispered through my earpiece. Encrypted burst transmission. At 2:03 p.m., the outbound data spike began again. But this time, they traced it, not to random servers, but to a Shell Corporation routing node linked to an overseas energy consortium currently under investigation for infrastructure probing. The confirmation lasted 6 minutes. Then, at 2:08 p.m., the van doors opened for the first time. 2 men stepped out, casual clothes, no visible equipment. They weren't checking houses. They were calibrating signal strength using line-of-sight triangulation with the relay. At 2:09 p.m., unmarked vehicles boxed the van silently from both ends of the street. No sirens, no shouting, just controlled movement. The 2 men froze mid-step. Within seconds, they were detained. The van interior revealed a mobile signal booster and packet capture relay unit, enough to intercept, inject, and confirm authentication attempts within a short proximity radius. They weren't burglars. They were testing a vulnerability before exploiting it. The agent beside me exhaled slowly. They were confirming whether you still had the key, he said. If you reconnected consistently without interference, they would have assumed the patch wasn't deployed, meaning they were weeks away from exploiting Route 17. I felt something between anger and relief settle in my chest. They hadn't wanted my data. They'd wanted confirmation of weakness. My home had simply been the easiest bridge to it. That evening, the FBI contacted the infrastructure company directly. Emergency patch deployment initiated under federal oversight. The vulnerability closed. But that wasn't the end, because someone inside that company had known the flaw still existed, and they had sent operators to confirm it. It wasn't random. It wasn't foreign alone. It was internal, and it was deliberate. The arrest made headlines 2 days later, but the real shock came quietly through internal briefings. The 2 men in the van weren't freelancers. They were contracted field technicians linked to a Shell vendor hired by a subcontractor inside the energy holding company that had acquired my former client. That subcontractor had access to system maintenance schedules. They knew Route 17 hadn't been patched. They knew the vulnerability window still existed. What they didn't know, until they probed my home network, was whether I still retained a final override key that could permanently seal it. My archive file had become their confirmation target. The FBI didn't need my testimony to connect the dots. They followed money trails. internal emails, procurement authorizations disguised as network resilience testing. Someone had authorized reconnaissance without triggering corporate oversight protocols. That meant one thing: plausible deniability. If they could verify the flaws silently and exploit it during peak load conditions, they could manipulate regional distribution markets, force short outages, then profit from energy volatility. 8 seconds of access was all it took to trigger cascading alarms and reroute demand. They hadn't needed my house for data extraction. They needed it for signal validation. My archive camera access had become their calibration point. 3 weeks later, federal investigators arrested a senior infrastructure analyst inside the holding company. His role gave him visibility into patch deferrals and legacy system vulnerabilities. He knew exactly where the weakness lived, and he knew I had once documented it. Internal communications revealed something colder than greed. He had searched archive consultant records and flagged my name as the only external engineer who retained an undeployed override key. Instead of approaching legally, he authorized external probing to confirm whether the key still existed and whether I was aware of the flaw. He miscalculated one thing. He assumed I'd ignore it. The day the vulnerability was formally patched under federal supervision, an agent called me personally. Route 17 is sealed, he said simply. 8 seconds of weakness, closed permanently. The analyst now faced charges tied to attempted infrastructure manipulation and conspiracy. Mr. Darnell knocked on my door that evening. He didn't say much, just handed me a small envelope. Inside was a printed screenshot from his own camera. The first Tuesday they parked near his house before moving to mine. I almost didn't call, he admitted quietly. I nodded. You did, I said. That was enough. Life didn't return to normal immediately. I replaced every smart device with hardwired systems, air-gapped sensitive machines permanently. And I documented everything in writing, because vulnerabilities don't disappear just because one door closes. They migrate. Weeks later, I received one final call from the FBI. The agent's tone was calm. They weren't planning a blackout, he clarified. They were planning a fluctuation, something subtle, enough to test market manipulation without public panic. I understood immediately. Quiet exploitation, profitable chaos. Invisible to most, they had underestimated two things. The first was my memory. The second was my refusal to ignore patterns. The white van never returned. The camera never activated again. Tuesday at 2 p.m. became just another quiet hour in the week. But I never forgot the lesson. Surveillance doesn't always mean you're the target. Sometimes you're just a test case. And sometimes the only thing standing between vulnerability and disaster is one person who decides to check the footage instead of dismissing the feeling. When Mr. Darnell called, he didn't know he was interrupting an operation tied to infrastructure exploitation. He just knew something didn't feel right. That was enough. Because 8 seconds of weakness is all it takes. Unless someone closes a door before it opens.